Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak in response to the budget handed down last week, and in doing so acknowledging the work of the Treasury officials to support in doing that. Mr Speaker, in essence, budgets are a statement of values. They are a tangible demonstration of the mark a government seeks to make on their community, not only in that point in time in response to immediate needs, but also by the decisions contained within the vision for the future of this state. Whilst there are many worthy initiatives in this budget, and I echo the sentiments of the member who just resumed his seat in terms of the investments in my seat of Franklin, it sadly reflects the narrow-minded thinking and reactionary approach this government has taken over the last 8 budgets. It is a missed opportunity, falling back to the short-term pump priming and political hole-plugging approach that betrays the needs of our community and the need for a larger, more constructive and forward-thinking vision that this moment demands. There is no doubt the budget has been handed down at a time of great uncertainty. Whilst COVID has ravaged economies and communities around the world for the last 18 months, it is clear we are far from seeing the end of its impacts. Budget papers identify clearly the uncertainty of the COVID-19 pandemic and the risk it presents. The risk would be clear to anyone to see if we were to have an outbreak on the island, not only materially on the budget, but also on the impact on the broader Tasmanian community and our health system. It would be devastating, Mr Speaker. You only have to see the impact it is having on the community of New South Wales and to an extent in other states. It is heartbreaking to watch. Having said that, I wish to draw your attention to the optimistic assumptions underpinning these budget forecasts. Page 24 of budget paper number 1 states that the economic forecasts and projections within this budget assume that, and I quote, outbreaks in other jurisdictions are effectively contained and relatively short-lived. Further, Mr Speaker, the budget forecasts assume, and I quote, that there are no extended state border restrictions that materially impact the Tasmanian economy. Now, Mr Speaker, all of us in this chamber hope for a best-case scenario moving forward. We do not want extended lockdowns. We do not want continued border closures. But most of all, we do not want COVID running rampant through vulnerable communities with a low vaccination rate. But we must be realistic and recognise Tasmania's luck could run out and we may find ourselves in lockdown. And if that happens, the government needs to step up and offer real support to those groups that will do it tough and not waste the opportunity for reform and implementing better ways of doing things. The economic impact of the mainland lockdowns are being felt here in Tasmania, not only in the cancellations of bookings for our tourism and hospitality industry, but also the great uncertainty created with now more and more mainlanders simply not even risking their trip to Tasmania. After 18 months of this, we are now seeing the cumulative impact it is having on our tourism and hospitality sectors. Their ability to survive after taking hit after hit is severely diminished. We have all heard stories of survival, then recovery, only then to be dashed again by the recent turn of events. Whilst recent government announcements of support are welcome, it is clear that for many businesses it will not be enough. More needs to be done, and the inability of the government to have a comprehensive economic plan that assists in diversifying the Tasmanian economy and building genuine partnerships to enable growth and innovation is beyond disappointing. We will feel the impacts of this inaction for years to come. Mr Deputy Speaker, we should also acknowledge that there is a cumulative impact on our public sector workforce, the wonderful people that deliver essential services. They are under enormous pressure. The fatigue and cumulative pressure that they are under is significant and should not be disregarded. From the nurses and staff at the COVID testing centres and vaccine clinics, to the contact tracers and border staff, to the teachers facilitating remote learning for the first time, so many Tasmanian public sector workers have stepped up over the last 18 months. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, in short, the environment is tough, but that should be no excuse for a lack of ambition shown in this budget. Despite the spin of this government, the fundamentals of the budget are not as strong as they would have us think. We know going into this pandemic, the government was already staring down a massive blowout in net debt of over $1 billion. We know that they have relied on GST windfall gains and outrageous raiding of the government business enterprise to fund their cobbled-together fiscal strategy. And we know the chronic underdelivery of infrastructure spending has continued to be banked by this government and dressed up as good budget management, when in reality it is failing communities across the state with the non-delivery. Again, this year is no different, with barely $600 million spent out of a $1 billion plus program. We know their own Treasury Department has called out this mismanagement multiple times in the budget sustainability reports released over the last few years. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, having said that, in these times, governments across the world are being given a licence to take the necessary steps via their balance sheet to support the community through what is a once-in-a-100-year event. However, that licence should not be seen to be given without qualification. The budget position must be sustainable. The measures taken must be reasonable, and the medium to longer term strategy must be clear. Our debt position is deteriorating, with net debt blowing out to in excess of $4 billion. This debt position is compounded when you take into account the unfunded public sector superannuation liability, combined with the debt being held on the books of our government business enterprises. It soon starts to add up. So, Deputy Speaker, now this government points to the apparent surpluses they have forecast in the forward estimates. Now, we know there is significant doubt about the government's ability to deliver these, and we know that on the key measure, which in my mind is the underlying net operating balance, the measure that removes the impact of one-off specific capital projects funded by the Commonwealth, shows significant deficits across the forward estimates. It's close to $600 million in this year's budget. Again, we see in the budget papers the reliance on the continuing GST windfall gains from the Commonwealth. These run of windfall gains cannot last forever. In fact, we know they won't, because of the removal of the transitionary agreement on revenue that falls over into 26-27, the outcome of a terrible deal for Tasmania negotiated by this Treasurer. These illusory surpluses based on underspend and infrastructure delivery failure will simply not be sustainable, Mr Deputy Speaker. The community will simply not accept that. So, we are in tough times. The community are calling out for support in the short term and also giving this government the political capital to make some structural changes to build a more sustainable budget. However, we have not seen that challenge being taken up by this government in this budget. In health, we again see the sugar hit investment in this year's budget, but then see the investment drop away over the forward estimates. The investment in elective surgery is welcome, but where are the initiatives to deal with ambulance ramping, bed block, and the bottlenecks in our system that delay access to healthcare and place even more pressure on a system that can't take any more? We see an announcement outlining funding for more positions for health professionals, but with little or no initiatives to address the current situation where many positions are simply unfilled because the work environment you would place them in is precarious and, in the words of many health professionals, unsafe. Mr Deputy Speaker, in housing, we again see the business as usual approach with the announcements of hundreds of houses being built over the forward estimates. Again, this government's track record on delivery is woeful. Mr Deputy Speaker, the 4,240 people languishing on the public housing waiting list would also be disappointed in this budget. The budget papers reveal the public housing waiting list is expected to blow out to 5,000. It is now taking, on average, 68 weeks for people to access housing. That may be 68 weeks living on a couch, in a car, in a tent, and in a vulnerable situation. This is not acceptable, Mr Deputy Speaker, and if this is the situation when we are supposedly the economic envy of the nation, what might happen to the housing waiting list if we're affected by prolonged lockdowns? Mr Deputy Speaker, there is a housing crisis, and in question time yesterday, Minister Ferguson referred to people seeking access to housing as being on the margins of society. The margins of society. And that sentence epitomises his misunderstanding of how dire the situation is. Mr Deputy Speaker, housing is no longer an issue impacted by people on the so-called margins of society. By this government's inability to respond to the housing needs of Tasmanians and in their inaction creating a crisis, it is now a mainstream issue affecting tens of thousands of Tasmanians. Being able to have a roof over your head is a foundational bedrock of a happy life and being able to fulfil one's potential. Without it, the consequences ricochet through our community and the costs are far greater than the sum of the investment in social and affordable housing. Mr Deputy Speaker, a business-as-usual approach to the housing crisis will not cut it. Again, it's a missed opportunity. Now, I won't spend too much time outlining the various Liberal infrastructure promises made over the last 8 years, because they will all be familiar to you. Too familiar, perhaps, because they are the same promises and vague commitments that resurface every year. Projects that were supposed to be delivered or be well underway by now have fallen years behind schedule or have failed to progress much at all. Mr Deputy Speaker, this government has demonstrated a chronic inability to deliver infrastructure on time. As a result, much of this year's supposedly record level of infrastructure spend is an accumulation of this infrastructure underspend over the last few years. In my electorate of Franklin, we see major traffic congestion issues that have impacts across the Greater Hobart region, but the key announcement at the recent elections, South Arm Highway and Pass Road upgrades and the Rugby Road upgrade, the Algona interchange upgrade, and even the Huon Township bypass, the Link Road, will not be delivered until the time the next election is due. And that's the timeline that's scheduled, not according to the record of this government. Mr Deputy Speaker, it is too little, too late. For many years, the government's single key economic card played has been to pump stimulus into the building, construction and civil construction industries. The stimulus is, of course, welcome, but it really is only one piece of the puzzle. You can pump support in, but the industry can only go so fast. And when the industry are desperately dealing with a major skill shortage, a skill shortage that's been talked about for years, with little or no effective government response, it will act like a dead hand on that stimulus, which exposes the ill-timed and poor thought-out attack on our TAFE system. A system chronically underfunded over the 2 terms of this government is now facing an uncertain future, as it is clear the government have little or no idea what they are seeking to achieve with the corporatisation of this trusted institution. Mr Deputy Speaker, TAFE should be invested in to respond to the skill shortages and be supported in building stronger partnerships with industry rather than being dismantled. The corporatisation of TAFE is the wrong idea at the wrong time, and the consequences of it will be profound. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the only spark of a forward-thinking initiative in this budget is the creation of the new entity, the Renewables, Climate and Future Industries Tasmania, an organisation reporting directly to the Premier. Now, this new entity is tasked with delivering on the promise that is our renewables energy future, namely hydrogen, Marinus, and through that link, pumped hydro, wind and other renewable energy projects and associated economic uplift. But let's be clear what this really is. The government, and in particular the Minister for Energy, Guy Barnett, has been talking big on this issue, making grandiose predictions about these projects for a number of years now. But, particularly in relation to Marinus, the Minister and his government has abjectly failed to explain who will pay for it, what will be the ownership model will be, and what are the arrangements will be for the Tasmanian consumers, factoring in the cost and its impact on the national energy market. Mr Deputy Speaker, we also know the government were late to the party on hydrogen and have been playing catch-up ever since. And we now have heard from industry players that the role the government is playing in delivering on the hydrogen promise is far from helpful. Mr Deputy Speaker, this new entity is not a big, bold, new visionary exercise. It's a rescue mission. Let's call this what it is. It's an acknowledgement of the failure of both this Minister for Energy and the Office of the Coordinator General to progress these important projects for Tasmania. Mr Deputy Speaker, this government celebrates its position on response to a climate emergency by effectively taking credit for work done here over successive governments. The response to the recent IPCC report demands more action, as do the Tasmanian community. A business-as-usual approach simply does not cut it. Mr Deputy Speaker, we know that the government have multiple leverage points on dealing with the cost of living and also the cost of doing business in Tasmania, particularly through our government business enterprises. But in this budget, there is zero attempt to conceptualise a different way of doing things and the structure of these GBEs to maximise the impact they have on our economy and our community. Mr Deputy Speaker, let's get the government business enterprise working for Tasmania. Again, another missed opportunity by this government. So in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, we are in some of the toughest of times, but we are a resilient community, a strong community, and we will get through this together. The Tasmanian community has provided an authority for this government to be bold, to not only get us through this moment in time, but importantly make decisions and take the necessary steps to set this state up for the world that follows. And in my view, Mr Deputy Speaker, this budget misses that opportunity.